If your home isn't safe, support is still here. Go to stillhere.ie for a list of supports, an initiative of the Government of Ireland with frontline services in your community.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball.
Now you're welcome back. We're turning to review the Sunday Papers. We have Colm Keys of the Irish Independent with us and Shane Keegan, former League of Ireland manager, a writer as well. You can hear us there, lads?
Yeah, spot on, Joe.
Excellent. Great to have you with us. Thanks so much for coming on today. So I'll go through the back pages very quickly to kick things off. I have the Mail on Sunday in front of me here. It's Kevin De Bruyne giving Manchester City a kick in when they're down, I suppose. De Bruyne, he was on Belgian radio and he says he could quit City. Could as opposed to would, but could quit City if they can't overturn their Champions League ban. No Europe, no point. And a picture of De Bruyne there. And then also, Ireland could tour Oz in October as Beaumont returns. Two separate stories. Bill Beaumont obviously re-elected as chairman of World Rugby, as we've been telling you before the ad break. And then Ireland, it seems, being lined up to tour Australia in October. With, it says, World Rugby pushing for the soon-to-be-cancelled July test rescheduled for later in the year to help the cash-strapped Southern Hemisphere unions, and the Australian Union in particular is in dire straits. Matt Williams was telling us last week on the show up to 150 million in the red, all things combined. Their CEO effectively pushed out of her job in the last week as well, so Australian rugby could do with that cash, although you're not going to have fans there, so the income won't be what it might have been. Sunday Independent then, Let the Children Play. Colm O'Rourke here making that call on the front page of the Sunday Independent sports section. We can't stay frozen by fear. There has to be a way to deliver health and happiness sooner. Beneath that, Premier League clubs split over plan to finish season. Neil and I touched on this just before the ad break. So it seems there is a rift between the top 14 Premier League clubs and then the 6 bottom clubs in terms of how they finish the season. The 6 bottom clubs, i.e. Brighton, Watford, West Ham, Bournemouth, Norwich and Sam Wallace says to a lesser extent Aston Villa, are opposed to using neutral grounds to finish out the season. The cynic would tell you they are just opposed to finishing the season full stop because it guarantees them avoiding relegation, as opposed to doing it on medical grounds. They don't really talk about medical grounds, they talk about the integrity of the season as opposed to reading different medical literature. But that's the situation in the Premier League as of their meeting on Friday. There is a split between the top 14 and the bottom 6. Interestingly, if they're to have a vote on it, you only need 14 votes to carry any motion. So they could carry it, but to what extent do you want to risk civil war, maybe is the dilemma at the moment. Sunday World then, bottoms up, relegation threatened teams could vote to end the season early and rule out the prospect of the drop, with Liverpool crowned champions. That's Kevin Palmer. And beneath that, Sean McGoldrick, Croker Choker, GAA's hierarchy dread at prospect of playing finals behind closed doors. Then in the Star, Project Restart hitting the buffers already. Player revolt. Top stars fear being put at risk. Foreign aces to go to government. That is the other point in all this. It certainly seems a sizable quotient of the players are looking on as the meetings happen at Premier League level and government level, and the players are saying, well, we don't plan on going back, or certainly a reasonable proportion of them are thinking that way. Sunday Mirror then, let's get it on. Pep is hoping government will give football the thumbs up this week. The UK government are announcing their way out of the current lockdown measures on Thursday. Probably be something similar to what we've had here over the last couple of days. Sun Sport then, Project Reject, uproar as clubs tell players they can opt out of big returns. So bosses at Premier League clubs have told the players they can opt out of Project Restart for health and safety. And then Stroot, mate, it's a picture of Gary Neville with an Australian hat on, the corkscrews and the strings, and the Premier League, says Alan Nixon, is being offered an amazing Plan B escape route to end the season in sunny Australian city Perth. So worried Chiefs are trying to find ways of playing the final 92 games in England with a neutral venue master plan in place, but they are constantly finding hurdles. TV pundit Gary Neville claimed the top flight should finish behind closed doors overseas. The solutions just become more and more ludicrous and strained and full of logistical nightmares the deeper you get into it. So that's the back pages as we stand. We might start in that theme because it's kind of the one we've started on most weeks reviewing the Sunday papers. For instance, Colm, I mentioned Colm O'Rourke on the front page of the Sunday Independent. He's looking on with a fair degree of impatience, you would have to say.
Yeah, just on your point there, Joe, for all the starts of all the various sports across the continent and across the world, it's very, very hard to keep track of it. And then you throw in the government's planned schedule last Friday evening. So keeping track of it all and just going through the papers, there is such a deluge of protocols, potential starting dates, everything, that it's just a mass to get to grips with who is starting where, what's involved, and there is obviously so much of it in the papers and in the news that it'd be quite difficult to track who's just going to take off when and where. But across the front page, as you said, of the Sunday Independent, Colm O'Rourke is clearly hankering for a quick return, and specifically, he believes underage teams can start getting ready, and his idea is that they should be up and running in June. But of course, that's outside the window that the government have prescribed, which is July 20 for Gaelic Games, and that was obviously announced on Friday night. But Colm's contention is at that moment though, people, he says, seem frozen by fear. But I suppose fear, you might replace that with caution, because the idea of social distancing happening on the pavement and in the shopping centres and everywhere else being still in place by the time July 20 comes, and yet that's the day when Gaelic Games and soccer, certainly leagues, with limited attendances, that's when the government are saying these can happen. Whether the sporting organisations allow them to happen, remains to be seen, because on the pitch, nobody can say with any certainty what social distance measures should be taking place within the confines of the pitch, and that still isn't answered. I did read a piece in the Irish Times with Cillian de Gascon over the weekend. It was online over the weekend, which pointed out that he's a member of the public health team that are overseeing all of these measures, and they would not be recommending a return to play for a long, long time until a vaccine is found. And I've found that quite stark. They're not saying they would prohibit it, but they wouldn't be recommending it. So I think there's still a lot of caution out there. Obviously there's fear, but in sporting terms, there's caution. Colm is contending, club underage matches should be able to start on soon, on the basis that children are not perceived to be carriers of it or don't transmit it. He says there's no evidence to say that has been found, but there's no evidence to say it isn't either. So it is very, very much unknown. But anyway, he's clearly angling for a start, and probably quite rightly say the balance now is coming very close to where people want to move on, measured against the public health protocols that are still in place.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know exactly who's infecting who or how or when, so it's inconclusive, and that's a significant enough risk to take.
Absolutely, and I just think even, maybe in 3 months' time, the picture will be a lot different when the green light goes for Gaelic Games and soccer in 3 months. A lot can happen, obviously, and you'd accept that. But I do think some players will have reservations about it even then, and you will see divided dressing rooms.
Yeah. Oh, I've no doubt, and it's interesting there in the headlines that Premier League teams are giving players the options to opt out, and we're talking about professionals there, very well paid professionals. So when you're talking about amateurs, some of whom may be working on the front line, going cheek by jowl with other players, then it becomes a whole lot more complicated. Like you made the point there, and Colm is making it, what people want, and we all know what people want. I mean, none of us want this. None of us want any aspect of this. But what we want isn't what's best for us. And it's interesting you mentioned the Cillian de Gascon piece, because I read that as well over the weekend. And if we're going to be guided by expertise here, then that's what we should promote. And Cillian de Gascon's opinion on all this is completely at odds with what Colm O'Rourke is saying. For instance, he's making points like, it's essential that we understand how infected Ireland has become. So he's talking here about the need for a zero prevalence study, which is looking basically, get a sample of the population, get us three, get another couple of hundred people, and see what percentage of the population has been infected with the virus. Until we know that, until we know to what degree herd immunity has been established or not, then it's very difficult for us to make a lot of wide-ranging decisions. So de Gascon in that piece with Gavin Cummesky talked about how, well, maybe 70% of the population have this, maybe 50% of the population have had this. Equally, if it turns out only 5% of the population have had this, then that puts us in an entirely different position. That leaves 95% of the country still incredibly susceptible. It leaves us at large open to a second wave. And then on the issue of testing, Colm O'Rourke makes the point that we need a system where you can be tested and have the result within 24 hours. In that scenario, sport is not only possible and desirable, but a necessity for well-being. Now, I don't disagree that sport is a necessity for well-being, but it's interesting, again, what de Gascon says here about getting to a point where we have 24-hour testing. So he says team sports are going to be in a very difficult position. Even with testing, you can do it daily, but all that tells you is that you're negative at that point in time, and then there's a 24-hour window to interacting with other people. So he says at some point your test will turn positive because you've been infected and the viral load is building up in your system. So you will reach a threshold where you become infectious, and then depending on where that falls in your testing schedule, you can't eliminate the risk completely. So at some point in that 24-hour period, this is me talking, not him, at some point in that 24-hour period, you'll hit a threshold, the viral load will build up, you will become infectious, Shane, and then you are infectious, and across warm-ups, across 70 minutes, 80 minutes or 90 minutes, you come into contact with pretty much every player on the pitch, I would say, give or take. Certainly too many for comfort, and maybe numerous officials as well, inadvertently or otherwise. So even when we get to a point of 24-hour testing, it is still going to come with risk. And we're at a point now where we have to figure out where the risk stops being worth it. And that's the big dilemma for sport in particular.
Yeah, I suppose the line Colm takes is particularly bullish, which can be his way at times, I suppose. And he mixes some very, very good points with some emotive language that he's obviously choosing to use to try and stir people up a little bit. I mean, he talks about the toll, both mental and physical, on people's well-being at the moment is enormous. He later on talks about the imprisonment of over 70s also being questionable. But he does make some good points. And I'd probably be in his camp more than a lot would in terms of, one, my want and need for sport to come back, and two, I probably wouldn't land on the more extreme end of the scale when it comes to talking about the extent of the precautions we should be taking. But as you said at the start, Joe, an awful lot of the stories overlap with each other today. And when you read Colm's piece, and then you go on to read Tommy Conlon's piece, which we'll come to, I know, but when you look at the hoops that the Premier League are going to have to jump through to try and make soccer come back over there, it just doesn't marry with anything close to what Colm is asking for in his piece.
Yeah, obviously there's, the GA have clearly said that they want to press ahead with club action first, and that sets aside the inter-county games until much later in the year. Well, how do you go about testing every club player that's going to take to a field? It's almost impossible. And I think in that Irish Times piece over the weekend, it's quite clear that sport will be well down the pecking order when it comes to actual testing. There will be no great preference, and certainly the width and the breadth of the number of club players that there are would make that extremely difficult. So there's a lot of key points, obviously, in Cillian de Gascon's piece. With Colm, there is a sense of let's just get on with it and override some of the risks, and he sets out some sanitation protocols around the dressing room, but that still doesn't qualify how players who stand beside each other in a contact sport where there is a lot of close marking over long periods of time, how does that work out? And that still hasn't been explained. And I think, as I said earlier, some players will still have reservations of that, even though there is a desire clearly for everybody to crack on with it to a degree. But medically, is it possible? I still have my doubts.
And it was interesting at the cabinet meeting, we're at that point now where there's the strict medical advice. And I mean, really, you could follow something through and say, well, medically, if you leave your home, you're encountering risk, even in the best of times. But there's the strict medical advice, and then there's the needs of society. And that's what Colm is talking about here. And I can totally understand that point. And Shane, I suspect you and lots of others will agree with them. But let me put it to you this way, though. When it comes to the return of sport, there is the well-being argument, as far as I can see, talking broadly, but there's the well-being argument and then there's the financial argument. So let's park finances for a second when it comes to GAA, and that's not really what Colm's talking about at all. So if we tease out the well-being argument, why do we need games? Why can't we all go training and players can wash their hands, kick footballs to each other, work on their touch, work on their fitness, and do it all in a very safe way. Why do we need competition? Why is that so urgent for our well-being? Because if you train and train well, you still get, I would say, 95% of the benefits. You get interaction with other people and your friends. It's good for your head, physical exercise, sense of improving as a team, whatever you want. It ticks all the boxes. So why do I need to mark you at close encounters for 70 minutes and us be rubbing against each other for 70 minutes?
Because players need something to aim for, Joe. And as much and all as they might enjoy the camaraderie of being within a group and being within a team, at the end of the day, you've got a goal and everything is aimed towards that goal. I mean, when you get up in the morning, your day has a purpose, knowing that you're going to training session that evening. Those training sessions have a purpose because you're working towards a game that's coming up shortly. Those games have a purpose because you're working towards trying to win a championship. If there's no championship, all of that trickles back and you wonder why you're getting up in the morning.
Yeah, I don't buy that, actually. I must say, I don't buy that. I mean, lads train in November for championships that start in summertime. Your goal can be to get to X on the fitness test. Your goal can be to improve your touch. Your goal can be any number of things. Now, I'm talking here in the context of the risk, Shane. Like, for me, that's not a good enough reason to risk people's health.
And that's me trying to give you the argument as to, I suppose, why it's needed. Is that outweighed against the negatives? It's not. Like, I want sport as much as Colm wants, believe
sure.
me, arguably more, but it isn't going to happen, and it can't happen.
Colm, what are you hearing from the GAA? Are they keeping tight-lipped even in winks and nods?
They have, no, because I don't think there's any I don't think they have any backdoor channel into all of this. I think anything that has been leaked out or anything that has been published, from my knowledge of it, is the first time they've heard of it is when it has come out, or when certainly last Sunday morning, the first they heard of specific testing for intercounty players was when they read it or heard it on the RTE podcast, where it was first, and then in the Sunday Independent. But I think they've taken a very cautious approach to it. I think John Horan's intervention on RTE last Monday, where he clearly stated, well, we'll be adopting public health advice if they are to do that, and taking Killian de Gascon's word on it, well, then they will take that instead of the government's advice as per last Friday, that you can press ahead. But I think somewhere there will be a balance. Friday night offered a roadmap for the GAA to get pitches open, as with soccer and other sports, on May 18, allowing up to a maximum of 4. So I think you will see players back out training in their clubs from May 18 in small groups, and obviously ramping that up 3 weeks later when the June deadline, phase 2, kicks in. I think you'll see bigger numbers, but obviously still working in small groups. So from the point of view of what you say, Joe, working on your touch and being out in the open for the next 3 months, I think there will be a desire, and players will get that opportunity to get out into the outdoors, get doing something in a safe way. But when July 20th kicks in, I think we probably will see some games, and it'll be up to players at that stage to decide, well, if you deem it safe enough, then, obviously we have a game structure here. And I think you'll see counties running off abbreviated championships. To my mind, it would take any county, any of the bigger counties, if you take Cork, if they are to press ahead with it, it would take them 12 weeks to complete a club championship programme, 6 weeks football, 6 weeks hurling. So at the outside, I think you're looking at 3 months from early August. It would probably bring you to the end of October. And after that, then, you could be looking at an inter-county championship, possibly behind closed doors. Maybe the public health picture will have changed by then. But that's the likely roadmap for all GAA counties. There'll obviously be no provincial club championships if there's an inter-county championship. But John Horan did allow for the fact that the championship might conclude in 2021. And I think in the circumstances, I get the feeling that a majority of players, not all obviously, because everybody has their own opinions in this, a majority of players would like to get on with it, and even if it was to play it behind closed doors, they'd be happy to do so. Now that does raise a financial question that I'm sure we'll get to in the next few minutes.
Yeah, Shane, I know you picked out a piece Sean McGoldrick had on that point. Just before we get to that, you'd obviously be very au fait, Shane, with the feelings in the League of Ireland, and you've managed Galway United and Wexford Youths, What is the sense there? It's a slightly different story there because we're talking about financial pressures being very real in the League of Ireland. Where are we when it comes to its return and the pressures clubs are under?
So very, very similar to what you've described with the English Premier League, with there being a 14 and 6 divide. There's very, very much a divide within the League of Ireland as well, Joe, I suppose, in terms of the haves and the have-nots, with the various different clubs and what they see as doable and not doable. I mean, just to touch back on what Colm said in terms of the return into training first, I'm back involved again at the moment. I'm in with Dundalk, and as a management staff, we would have held a Zoom call on Thursday evening to discuss, right, if and when we are given a date, how do we make this happen? As Colm says, do we bring them in groups, of 4 or 5? How do we design training plans to make sure that it's all non-contact? How do we get them in and out of the building without them having to get too close to each other, without having to touch door handles, all of that kind of thing? And that conversation has been had up and down the length and breadth of the country in both soccer, hurling, Gaelic football, everything at the moment. And it's a real tester for managers and the support staff to try and come up with the answers to all that. But going back to the League of Ireland, I think at the moment, it looks as though Dundalk and Shamrock Rovers seem to be the only two clubs who are saying that they see behind closed doors as being viable. Everybody else seems to feel that without the gate receipts, they just don't have the ability to pay their players on a regular basis. And I again, while I'm willing to pursue any avenue or want to see every avenue being pursued for the return, it's very hard to see it in the short term because those against are far outweighing those who are for.
Right, okay. I'll give Colm O'Rourke final word in fairness because he's not here to kind of tease through his article. He finishes up by saying, we're at a question posed earlier in this piece: who runs the country, the elected executive or the medics? Naturally, there has to be medical guidance, but ultimately there has to be a society. Things like golf, fishing, tennis, horse racing behind closed doors and sailing are surely safe by any standards. Team sports are slightly different, but there comes a time when a balance of risks must be assessed. We are close to that point. Without hope, there's no future. He finishes by saying the GAA should be actively seeking an early start date for underage games. There'll be 1,000 reasons not to do anything, but I hope to see young lads kicking football on long summer evenings in June, which I think we can all agree is a nice thought.
It is a nice thought, and I think underage games probably will precede any adult games. I would get that sense that it would be easier. Contact is less prevalent at underage level, and I think kids can probably be coached to concentrate on the skills more than the contact. So I think that side of it is easier. So I think Colm is probably right. You will see underage games. I don't think in June. I think the GAA will play safe and wait until the July deadline has passed to make sure that all the targets, public health targets, have been reached at that stage.
Shane, do you want to give us the Sean McGoldrick piece you mentioned? He just had a word on the finances. Let me guess, they're not good.
No, they're certainly not good, Joe. He has an interesting piece. I mean, I didn't realise, I suppose, that he seems to indicate here that the call is going to be made next week. I don't know whether that's a definite and that it absolutely has to be called next week, but that gives them a very, very short time to make up their mind if that is going to be the case. When I say the call, obviously, I mean the call as to whether the Inter-County Hurling and Football Championships will go ahead behind closed doors. But I mean, he throws out a couple of figures. He talks about it being budgeted at over 30 million for games in the All-Ireland Series alone, and that's what they're going to be out of pocket for, which is obviously a serious sum of money. He then has an article inside where he goes through the various different figures that we've seen from time to time in terms of what each county has been getting. He also brings up the whole season ticket thing, which raised its head during the week. I think the GAA were maybe cut out a little bit in terms of changing the wording around whether season tickets would be refunded. But I found it interesting that he actually lets us know that the 2021 season ticket revenue has already been divided out to the counties to help them get through this period. Never mind talking about the 2020 season ticket revenue. But yeah, look, I suppose the crux of the whole thing is that a lot of the GAA finances aren't in the best of places at the best of times. Never mind before this struck. It's going to make it very, very difficult for some to make ends meet.
Yeah, I remember John Green, Colm, did a piece a couple of weeks ago where he looked at the level of debt across the counties, and it wasn't as bad as anecdotally you feel it is.
No, Joe, it wasn't,
it
because
was a more pleasant picture.
myself and John worked through a lot of the county board reports for that, and we were looking at the cash in bank figure, and it was very, very strong in a lot of counties.
Yeah.
But I think over the next few months that will deplete, because during the week the National Finance Committee, the GAA, had a conference call for all their treasurers, and they painted quite a stark picture of a financial year without inter-county games. The GAA will only take in, by current projections, and they're only current projections, obviously not everything is complete, but they will only take in about 10 million this year. Contrast that with 73.9 million last year.
Yeah.
That doesn't include the 13 million that the provincial championships, 13.2 or 3 million, the provincial championships, the 4 provinces would have taken in. So without broadcasting, that's about 14 million. That's what it was worth last year. So you're using on that. Without 36 million in gates. Now, obviously, you'd allow for an All-Ireland football final replay, and they had built that into any future projections. So you don't have that. There was a 10.5 million dividend from Croke Park, the stadium. So the stadium takes rent from the GAA for all the games that are played there. There was obviously concerts last year. There wasn't going to be concerts this year. And there's a lot of conference business that has had to be shelved because obviously Croke Park is shut at present. It's obviously not shut to COVID-19 testing. That's ongoing. But by and large, the core business of Croke Park has been shut down. So if you take those 3 income streams, broadcasting, gate receipts, and the Croke Park dividend, you're probably up to around, in the region of 50-something million. Tom Ryan actually said in a previous direction in a previous message to staff that they would lose 60 million. But when you compare income and expenditure, they think they'll get their expenditure down to around 25 or 6 million, given what they've had to pay out. The only money coming in will be from gates that have already come in for the leagues and the All-Ireland Club Championships. Some sponsorship money, about 4 million, they projected out of a potential 5 million. Some registrations, and then state funding, obviously state money. And the money they pay out, obviously, is a lot less because they won't have the match costs, they won't have player training, nutrition, grants to counties, and the capital expenditure. That's gone. That's a very big hole. They still have a 10 million coaching and games development spend that they want to keep, and that's obviously incumbent on keeping coaches and keeping schemes going when business does resume. So overall, they're looking at a 15 to 16 million deficit at the end of this financial year.
Okay, that's the voice of Colm Keys from the Irish Independent. We also have Shane Keegan with us, a podcast host with the 42 and opposition analyst, as he referenced there, with Dundalk. We'll take a short break for news headlines, and then there is much to get to in a few moments' time.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball. Join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter.
The National Standards Authority of Ireland have published a series of business guidance documents to help businesses struggling to deal with the impact of COVID-19. Whether you're a small retailer or a large manufacturer, we can offer you practical steps to help you meet the public health guidelines and reduce the risk of spreading infection. For more information on our guidelines and how to contact us, visit us at nsai.ie. This is an initiative of the Government of Ireland.
These are worrying times. Seriously ill children in Laura Lynn, Ireland's Children's Hospice, desperately need crisis care. They may be in isolation, but you can make sure they're not alone. When you donate at lauralynn.ie today, you can ensure some of Ireland's most vulnerable children get the care they need. We may be forced apart from one another right now, but none of us have to face this crisis alone. Please donate at lauralynn.ie and help a seriously ill child get the crisis care they need. Thank you, and stay safe.
At Guaranteed Irish, we believe enterprise is at the heart of thriving communities.
Like Pat the Baker, whose staff are delivering freshly baked bread daily across the country. Now is the time to support Irish businesses who work tirelessly and safely to ensure the nation is nourished, while we stay safe at home. Guaranteed Irish welcomes companies that are altogether better choices for our communities, so look out for it. Thank you to all the team at Pat the Baker for continuing to stock the shelves. GuaranteedIrish.ie. Altogether better.
With Virgin Mobile, there's nothing hidden. Now you can try unlimited 4G data, calls and texts for only €15 a month for 12 months. All on a 30-day contract. And better yet, everyone can try it. It's an offer that's bigger than big. See virginmobile.ie. Virgin Mobile. Nothing hidden.
Fair usage and T's and C's apply. €25 a month after offer. Ends 3rd of June 2020.
COVID-19 is here, so it's important to know all the signs. Symptoms include a high temperature, a cough, shortness of breath, or breathing difficulties. If you have symptoms, self-isolate to protect others and phone your GP. For 8 out of 10 people, rest and over-the-counter medication can help you feel better. Visit hsc.ie for updated factual information and advice, or call 1850 24 1850. Protection from coronavirus. It's in our hands. From the HSC.
Join that conversation. Text us on 53106. Texts cost 30 cents. On 106 to 108 FM.
On newstalk.com.
On smart speaker.
And on the Newstalk app. This is Newstalk.
It's 2 o'clock. Good afternoon. The HSE has apologised to the family of a person who died from COVID-19 after they were given the wrong body by a hospital mortuary. The incident happened at Mullingar Regional Hospital last weekend and an internal review has been launched. The Ireland East Hospital Group says a mistake led to the wrong remains being released to an undertaker. It says the issue was rectified once noticed and described it as an extremely rare event. The HSE's Chief Operations Officer, Anne O'Connor, hopes it's a one-off.
Clearly we would hope it's an isolated incident and certainly there are lots of procedures in place. So that incident is being investigated. We would hope that certainly the policies and procedures that are in place will ensure that that doesn't happen anywhere else.
The HSE's contact tracing app will store data on users' devices and not in a central service. The new tracker is viewed as a crucial tool in allowing social distancing restrictions to be relaxed. However, its launch has been delayed by several weeks. HSE CEO Paul Reid explains how it'll work.
We're going for the data to be stored on the phone. Notifications then that go out to people who may be positive is pushed out from an application on the phone, so not from any central data that we have. It works on a Bluetooth technology.
Irish universities will take a hit of around €400 million if foreign students can't travel here for education. Non-EU students often pay fees from €9,000 up to and including €54,000 a year. It's being warned that without this income, Ireland's 7 largest institutions will struggle to pay their bills. Jim Miley from the Irish Universities Association says it's unlikely many students will be able to travel.
We're really concerned that significant numbers of international students will not be able to come to Ireland next year, or indeed that Irish students who are due to travel overseas won't be able to go either. So it's a huge hit to our sector.
And in some other news, a man's appeared in court charged with a number of firearms offences in County Meath. 56-year-old Stephen Gibbons from Rockley House in Gormanstown appeared before Dundalk District Court this morning. He was charged with possessing a submachine gun and 12 rounds of ammunition in Richardstown on January the 15th this year. The accused was remanded in custody to appear before Cloverhill District Court next week. It's 2 minutes past 2.
Newstalk weather.
Thanks to the AA. To help in these challenging times, we've reduced the cost of our car insurance. Get our lowest price at the AA.ie.
Mainly dry today. Parts of Munster and South Leinster will get some rain or drizzle. Highest temperatures 13 to 16 degrees. And now you're up to date on Newstalk.
The Sunday Papers
on Off the Ball.
You're very welcome back. We're continuing our review of the Sunday Papers. We have with us Colm Keys from the Irish Independent, and we have Shane Keegan as well, who is a League of Ireland manager, currently Dundalk FC opposition analyst, and also a podcast host with the 42. Shane, I'll give you right a reply. The people have spoken on our little debate there.
Go ahead. What are they saying?
He says, Joe, you're bang on. We don't need a league. First step is letting people go back and train, play mini leagues within our squads. A lot of nonsense about what has to happen. It doesn't have to happen. These are games and sports for recreation. They don't trump national health, says Brian Dublin. Next one, I'm a standard club player, still training away with schedules sent on via WhatsApp. I would love the idea of bright summer evenings, rocking up to a match already in the shorts, ready to go. However, I just can't comprehend how we as players are supposed to play a full contact sport while practicing social distancing is still advised. And I don't know how rugby is classed as different in phase 5. Yeah, I saw that. Colm O'Rourke mentioned that as well. I'm not really sure when it comes to it how different hurling, scrum or GAA close marking is to rugby, but they've differentiated it all the same. Lads, I'd love to be playing football again. I work with my dad in his 60s. My wife is a nurse, so we are up to our eyes in being careful. I wouldn't train with my team, never mind play a match, because some 20-year-old could give me COVID and I bring it into my environment. I'd never forgive myself. And finally, Dave, Joe, agree, sport is important for mental health, but games aren't. I'm training for a marathon. The fact that it has been cancelled till 2021 is an opportunity to get better, not a reason to stop. If GAA players or soccer players don't have the same attitude, they'll never make county, says Dave. So, Shane, I haven't selected those to suit my argument, I assure you. Neil Tracy outside has put them through. That's the word.
Nah, Joe, look, I suppose I'm putting forward the argument as to why the likes of Colm and lots of other people, just people who don't happen to be listening to the show right now, would like to see a return for sport, while all the time, unfortunately, kind of looking at the whole situation and the realities of it and saying as much and all as I wanted to happen, I can see why it's unlikely that we will see any of it for probably at least 2, probably longer, 3-4 months.
It probably is the reality. So just to finish off on the GAA coverage, Joe Brawley had I thought it was a very interesting piece on page 2 of the Sunday Independent. Resistance in troubled times. People have talked, Colm, and I'm sure you've done pieces on the past about the role that GAA played in the North, especially during the Troubles. And Joe Brawley says, far from damaging the GAA, the Troubles gave us a real sense of identity. And he picks up from 1969 and Francie McCluskey's death, the 67-year-old farmer, and the Troubles as they began and continued for so many years. He says, the GAA during that time was our identity, part of an FU to a rotten state that we lived in. The result was that games flourished and our expression of them was fanatical and ferocious. And he talks about a couple of different instances here. A memorable one, actually, when Donegal came to play in a National League game the day after a bombing, and there was threat very much in the air, and Donegal did not want to travel, and he talks about them arriving almost ashen-faced and leaving ashen-faced as well. And these were the 92 All-Ireland champions, and they were beaten 3-16 to 7 points, just did not want to be there. Brawley's point is, the thing to remember about human beings is they adjust quickly. He's talking about the likes of Derry involved in the Troubles. Whether fighting in the trenches for years or being imprisoned or being diagnosed with a terminal illness, tougher than rats, we fight on and make the best of it. What was happening to us during the Troubles was what was happening to us during the Troubles was happening to everyone else across the North, and being in it together meant it was no big deal. It was just the way things were. There was no point making a fuss. And ultimately the point he gets to, Colm, and I'm sure it hasn't escaped the attention of lots of people, is that if you take, he writes, the fateful July day in Dungiven in 1969 as the starting point, the evidence is overwhelming. Wind forward 20-odd years and the children of the Troubles were poised to dominate the game. Talks about Down in 91, talks about Donegal in 92, talks about Derry 93, Down again 94. Tyrone should have won in 95, he argues, the famous Canavan pickup off the ground.
Peter Canavan,
yeah. And then goes on to say these teams formed the bridge to the Armagh-Tyrone axis, which dominated the 2000s, crushing Dublin, cracking Kerry. Again, he says, those boys were all children of the Troubles, born into a fanatical six-county GAA culture. And he talks about similar developments in club football as well, not least Crossmaglen with the barracks right by their pitch. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, because obviously plenty of stories down through the years of GAA clubs and GAA members coming under pressure because of nationality. People have lost their lives over. If you think back to Sean Brown locking up the gates of Balahi, and if you Terence Sambo McNaughton's testimony of going to training with a hurl was antagonistic to the Crown Forces from time to time. Joe Kernan would often tell you about the boot and bonnet when you were going to training. You'd have to open up your boot and your bonnet if you were seen with GAA crested bag in your back. So all of those pressures probably became a rallying point and brought them together. And Joe equates 1969 with that spell during the early 1990s. And it's a fair equation, because really those teams did take over, probably for a 4 to 5 year spell, obviously led by Down, and then continued on with Crossmaglen who had some of the most serious hardship given their geography, and an RUC base, British Army base, they took over part of their grounds, and that was a long-running saga for the GAA in attempting to broker that. But look how strong Crossmaglen came out of it. So it's a well-made point, I have to say, when you put all that together. If you take it from the late 60s and push forward for many of those guys who were obviously in their early part of their life, and they're in their mid-20s when they start to win All-Ireland. So they grew up with it and obviously thrived in it, and it brought them together. And some of the best facilities were built during that period, even though very little of it would have been state funded. But it certainly brought communities and gave them a much stronger identity, I always feel, than there perhaps is in the south among GAA clubs. I would have always felt that. Maybe not so much now. I think it's probably balanced out a little bit more. But certainly then they were very, very proud of their identity, their GAA identity. As Joe mentions, people like Peter Robinson and Gregory Campbell, they would have said that the GAA was the IRA at play, but Joe maintains the IRA had nothing to do about it. It was a community expressing itself, a community driven together by external forces, and one that was not going to be suppressed. And you'd have to agree that the GAA in the north came really strong out of the Troubles.
Shane, did you get a chance to go through this?
I did, Joe. I thought it was brilliant. Really, really interesting piece. I mean, some of the anecdotes within it, they seem surreal. What he's describing as his norm, I suppose, just seems absolutely surreal. And I suppose it really takes until you get to that second last paragraph when he talks about his own dad, and you start to think, okay, if this is what happened in your upbringing, now I can start to understand why everything else pales into significance, really. I mean, my own father was taken. We were thrown out of our beds and knocked about. He was dragged out of the house by soldiers as my mother screamed and tried to drag him back. And then he kind of finishes with his mother Anne getting a phone call. And you have to go and pick up Francie. There he was, standing outside in the middle of nowhere waiting for a lift. I mean, 3 years he was gone. And, it's a completely and utterly different life. Like, I can't imagine myself, my kids, anybody going through the things that they went through up there. And I suppose the fact that Joe just paints them as normal run-of-the-mill events in his life is just incredible, really.
Maybe there's an equation with where we are now, and that sport was their outlet. And we're talking about in our early segment there how much people want the normality of sport to be brought back into their lives. Maybe sport did present some normality against that background, and there's probably some correlation there.
Yeah, it's on page 2 of the Sunday Independent. Well worth a read. Resistance in Troubled Times is the headline. So if we move on, it's been a busy week on the anti-doping front, to say the least. Sport Ireland published their 2019 annual report. The James Cronin situation continued, certainly in the media, less from Munster or the RFU. And then, of course, Colm, in your wheelhouse, Ray Walker of the Carlow panel emerged as the player who had tested positive for Meldonia. So there's coverage in the papers, as you might imagine. On the James Cronin front, Paul Kimmage, the COVID diaries, when lockdown starts to bite, he is, writing about the way these things are treated generally, I suppose, the Cronin situation ultimately, and thinks there should have been more debate about it and more talk about it. He finishes up by making the point that I'm sure there's a good reason Sport Ireland are sitting on their hands and have yet to appeal the Cronin case, but I can't think of one, he says. So he wants to see the case appealed by Sport Ireland. They still have until mid-May, I think, to make up their minds on that. Una May was on the show during the week, and she was non-committal in that she couldn't comment effectively. But I did ask her if finances would come into it, and she said absolutely not. That money would be found if they felt the case should be appealed. So that's Paul Kimmage on page 3. Above that, Brendan Fanning is writing about it again. He touches on the interview we did with Anthony Davis. Davies is a judicial officer. He was appointed to examine the EPCR case against James Cronin, and Brendan Fanning picks up on a few points that he still feels are loose ends in the case, is the phrase he uses, and certainly makes the point that Munster could have done more here, I think, to talk about the case, explain the ins and outs of the case, and they haven't done that. Really all we've had from the RFU or from Munster has been press releases on the Monday evening when this broke, and this thing has continued on with questions being asked in the media. Fair questions, just looking for clarity on different things, and we haven't heard much from Munster, or heard anything from Munster or the player in question or the RFU as of yet. So that continues. You can listen back to the Davies interview from Wednesday. It's in the usual places on podcast, and equally myself and Rory O'Connor went through the EPCR report in quite a bit of depth the week before that. There's about a 35 minute in-depth going through it page by page discussion. So that is waiting for you, and the fact that there's no press conferences at the moment is certainly an aspect here, in that the journalists aren't being afforded the opportunity to ask questions of anybody concerned with Munster. So maybe a Zoom press conference of some sort might be a very good idea at the moment. Leinster have been doing that. It certainly is possible. So that continues. And then to make a busy week even busier on the anti-doping front, there was the Ray Walker case. And John Green is writing about that here, Colm. There's more detail on Ray Walker. He had been absent from the Carlow panel for 6 years, says John, had come back during this league campaign, 35 years of age, played in a couple of games, tested positive. He has accepted a 4-year ban. He could appeal this on the grounds that it was unintentional, which is what he is absolutely saying, and therefore he would go from a 4-year ban to a 2-year ban, and then potentially mitigating circumstances could come into it. James Cronin got a month, for instance, but Walker has accepted the ban of 4 years, frankly because he says there's no point in appealing this, in that my Carlow career is over regardless. But he does state in his press release, I did not intentionally take any banned substances. Anything that was found in my system was there completely unintentionally. I cannot explain for sure how the substance came to be in my system, but I was taking anti-inflammatories for a lower stomach issue around the time of the test. I am accepting the 4-year ban because I want this episode over and done with. And at 35, even a lesser ban would still mean I was unlikely to ever return to playing. It is not an admission of intentional wrongdoing on my part in any way. And he adds that from the time he joined the Carlow panel in November to the time the test took place in February, he didn't receive any anti-doping training or education. The point to put to you, Colm, to kick things off with, and it is the key point going forward, is about meldonium. And John Green makes the point that the presence of meldonium in Walker's system is of a huge concern in this whole episode. Walker says he had no idea how it got there, but meldonium, as we know, is not readily available in Ireland. And he quotes Una May, who said that it was unusual and we were surprised to see it being meldonium, but we can't speculate as to how it got there or how common it is or how available it is. And John Green concludes, Colm, by saying the problem now is there's unfinished business here. The presence of meldonium, he says, in the system of an inter-county player has not been properly accounted for. The player does not know how it got there. Sport Ireland does not know how it got there. So just how did it get there? Is there a medication or a supplement that is easily available to players and athletes that could contaminate them? Is there anybody trying to get to the bottom of this? And I must say, in this whole thing, that jumped out to me as the key question at the moment. Meldonium, very much Eastern European, Russian drug. We know it courtesy of Maria Sharapova. It's been banned since 2016 because in 2015, WADA realised that far too many athletes seem to need this medication. And this is the first time this has arisen on these shores. Who is looking into this? I mean, is there a contaminated supplement out there? A bit like contact tracing when it comes to COVID. I presume and hope somebody is sitting down with Ray Walker and saying, tell us every supplement you've taken, tell us every drink you've taken, tell us every restaurant you've eaten in, give us your life for the last couple of months in as much detail as you can, because if you don't know how this got there, then we need to potentially protect other players.
Yeah, it's a very, very worthwhile question. Obviously, like Brendan Fanning's piece, there's loose ends here too, and John has raised that. He points out that this meldonium is not sold over the counter. So who is looking at it? I suspect nobody is looking at it. Once there hasn't been a case, once he chose to waive his right for an appeal, a lot of that detail may be lost. Is it in the interest of Sport Ireland anti-doping to try and establish that? Well, they don't have their chance now. So maybe it's a matter for the Gaelic Players Association or the GAA. I don't know what the mechanism for that would be, because obviously he's now a suspended player, Ray Walker. I found it interesting that he did point out in a statement that he didn't receive any anti-doping education since he rejoined the squad. And yet the GAA came out with what I thought was a pretty robust statement in these circumstances, stating, and they outlined just precisely how many Carlow players actually did undertake anti-doping training. It was 36, so that would leave room for very few not to, because squads wouldn't be any greater than 40, and that would be some of the top teams. So that was quite a strong rebuttal and defence maybe of their anti-doping program. But it does raise a question, and obviously raise a question, well, how did meldonium get into the system? And it's really only one that probably Ray himself can shed light on.
Yeah, and he says he has no idea. Shane, what is the picture in the League of Ireland? I mean, it says here, for instance, that players, if they're to avail of their grants, have to complete online assessments and information pieces when it comes to anti-doping. The League of Ireland architecture, is that providing good information that's almost forced on players when it comes to this whole area?
Yeah, look, I find it interesting when you say there that they say 36 of the Carlow panel did receive the training. That would seem about right to me, in that it is compulsory, and there is information and training and a meeting held before the start of every season. Could I tell you that 100% of my players were at that meeting every time it was held? No, they weren't. There was probably one or two missing each time for varying different reasons, I suppose. So it's definitely, it's near on impossible to make sure that it's delivered to 100% of the people 100% of the time. I'd also argue, Joe, that just because somebody's standing at the top of a room giving information to players, that certainly doesn't mean that the players are taking that information on board. They can drift off in all kinds of directions and might have very little interest in what's been said to them, as hard and all as that might be to believe. They should certainly be clued in. But I suppose Niall Moynihan's take on all this, and I think he was on with G during the week, was that no matter what excuses the players come out with, it has got to fall back on them. And I think that's the biggest thing about the education, is trying to hammer home to them, lads, you have to know the ins and outs of what's going on here. And it really is quite simple. I mean, just before coming on the show, or before we started, I just said I'd check it out again. So like the Air Farm website that players are directed to, I mean, this could not be more simple to use. It really, really couldn't. You put in everything under the sun. So I threw Lemsip into it, okay? And believe it or not, when you throw Lemsip in, there's 11 different kinds of Lemsip. And of the 11 different kinds of Lemsip, I think 8 of them showed up as fine. And then 3 of them, including, naturally enough, I suppose, the max strength ones, they were not fine. So even within Lemsip, some things are you can take, some things can't. But as a player, if I wanted to take Lemsip, that took me 5 minutes. That's how easy it is for me to find out whether I can take it or whether I can't take it. So it's hammering that message home to the players that the ultimate responsibility lies with them. It can be tough, really, to get through to them on that sense sometimes.
It certainly seems to be the case. Colm, I'm sure you had a look at the ESRI report, which was published just before the new year. And it had the headlines about, the number of hours that players are putting into their inter-county careers and all these kind of things. But on the area around supplement culture, it was staggering in that, I'm quoting from memory here, I put all these points to Niall Moynihan during the week, but effectively, give or take, and across all levels, and hurling and football, Laurie Maher, Nicky Rackard, and championship as well, Sam Maguire and Liam McCarthy. But pretty much 25% of players, give or take, were sourcing their supplements from the internet. And the point was made in the ESRI report. If you go on the internet and you source these supplements there, Australian Anti-Doping did an investigation into this. About a fifth of supplements around the world are contaminated. So a fifth are contaminated. And yet we have, according to an ESRI study of GAA players in 2016, you had about a quarter of them going on the internet for their supplements. And this is even in the year that Brandon Sullivan buys his supplement in a health shop and it's contaminated, and he serves a 21-week ban. So I just wonder, where is the fall off in information here? Because I guarantee you, if you went around to any of these players who are getting their supplements off the internet and said, you realise that shake you're about to drink, there's a 1 in 5 chance that could be contaminated, and you're going to be on the front page and you're going to be on the news and there's going to be a stigma around your name. I don't think they would drink it. And yet, as of 2016, maybe things have improved dramatically, I don't know, but as of 2016, Colm, that was how inter-county players were going about their business, their own admission.
You've portrayed a picture of real risk there. A lot of the top teams, I won't say it all, would all have, doctors on hand, and the advice always is to consult your doctor with everything. And I know that to be the advice with a lot of the top teams, and a lot of the teams would say, whatever you're consuming, the advice is to refer to the doctor. And most of the top teams have a nutritionist. But you mentioned Laurie Maher there. As you go down the pecking order, the backup and resources for a lot of these teams, even with doctors, and certainly not nutritionists, the access to those services would not be as common. And that, in effect, presents a problem, because if testers can go down to Division 4 Alliance League training on a Tuesday night or whatever night it was in February, they can turn up anywhere, and there are 2,200 players who are under this scheme. All inter-county players, to my knowledge, are under this scheme. And they don't all have the resources to be able to check, well, the supplement that I'm buying here, that I want to take here, I'm not sure what's in it, so is it compatible? So I'll ring my doctor or my nutritionist, easy access. They don't all have that. So therein lies a difference between the teams maybe at the top and further down the chain. It presents real risks for those that are buying, for sure.
Yeah, it sure does. So we'll have to see what comes of it. I think the GAA or the GPA or some body overseeing the welfare of the players may need to come out and speak about just who is looking into the fact that meldonium was found in the player's system and what has been done potentially to protect other players. If, as Ray Walker says, he doesn't know how this ended up in his system. So that needs to be looked into, frankly. He's accepted the charge and he's taken the 4 years, so that negates the need for an investigation. But it's now a welfare issue, so we'll have to see what GPA, GAA, they would jump to mind. I can't think, Colm, who else really? I mean, one of those two is going to have to get involved.
Well, that's it. I think so. Just to provide a roadmap for other players, perhaps just to alert them to the potential dangers of a substance that's out there. So yes, I think it would be good advice to explore it a bit more and see where it takes. So another thing from the ASRI report that struck me was only 1 in 4 players have ever said they were tested. That seems pretty low to me. Now, obviously, squads change from year to year. It's not like, cycling athletics where they stay in program for a longer time. But 1 in 4, and even Sport Ireland officials would say that GAA is still low risk, so therefore there's considerably less testing than some of the more what they would describe as riskier sports. But 135 tests as opposed to 139. It has gone up since the middle of the last decade, but it actually dropped this year according to this week's anti-doping report.
Yeah, it dropped by 4. I read that report because we had Una May on the show this week as well. So again, I'm speaking from memory here, but I think I'm right in saying 212 tests was the number one number of tests. That was for cycling. You then had
athletics and rugby were the top 3.
Rugby was about 190.
More.
Yeah, rugby at about 190 and athletics at about 165. So then GAA comes 4th at 135. I guess the obvious point is there's far more GAA players than all of those sports. Probably those sports combined.
Together.
Easy,
probably. Easy.
Yeah. So, but it's
because of the financial inducements or the absence of them, they say, well, Gaelic Games is low risk, so that's the thinking behind the lower number of tests. Plus, I say there's a cost issue too.
That's the point.
GAA they're not part of the user pays scheme, so therefore there's probably a limit to what Sport Ireland can do on their own to get testers around the country and to get them to games. So 135, they've budgeted for that, and that's what it is. But there's an awful lot more players, obviously.
No, it's true.
Well, Joe, I think that figure would be less than 1 in 4 in the League of Ireland. I really do. I mean, I would have had 7 seasons as a manager, and across those 7 seasons, I'm just thinking back. There was one each season we got tested once. Now I don't know if that was less than other clubs, but definitely once each season 2 players pulled. So you're talking about 2 players out of a panel of 20 once a season. I think in one of the seasons at Wexford we were tested during a training session as well. That's the only time I ever had them arrive at a training session.
Right. I presume after games was far more routine.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. Only once. Yeah, I mean, they arrived once during each season, pretty much. Now, look, they're fairly stringent on it. I know I mentioned to you that I thought the Paul Flynn piece was good. One of the amazing bits that jumped out at me at Philip Lanigan's piece with Paul Flynn was where Paul Flynn said, I mean, initially Waterford weren't going to give into it at all. This is going way back to the start of it. I think it was 2001. I think it had come in the GAA, and Paul Flynn was tested in 2002. But he said initially they were just going to say no, they weren't going to do it. And it was quite funny that he says Cork's renowned knowledge of the rule book and the potential repercussions for Waterford's results standing was what helped to focus their minds. So it was, and they eventually caved in and gave it. But as I say, the line that jumped out to me was, so he, and by he means Al Guy, the arch nemesis of Michelle Smith at the time, I suppose. So he followed us down to one of the hotels in Thurles. Now, I mean, that's completely unheard of nowadays. I mean, any of the times that any of our players would have been tested, I mean, the final whistle hasn't gone 10 seconds, then this guy walks up to you and tells you which two random numbers had been drawn, what two players that equates to, and those two players are not allowed out of the tester's sight from the moment that final whistle is gone until the test is provided, you know. But obviously things have come along in leaps and bounds since Paul was tested, you know.
Still, a visit from the testers across a whole season isn't exactly rigorous. Like, there's going to be shortfalls in every sport. In the report they made, they've spent 2 million on testing. So what do we put that up to? 4 million, 6 million, 10 million? Where does it end? And in the last 2 years, so 2019, 2018, for all that testing, for all the 2 million spent each year, there was the Brandon Neely case where he left the ground and gave his reasons as to why, so he was hit with a 2-year ban. But in terms of adverse findings, 3 people for cannabis for 2 million spent each year. I mean, you just, like, it's there as a deterrent almost, as opposed to we're really going to catch people. I don't know, Colm, how much more you spend realistically. 2 million is not inconsiderable. Do we whack it up to 10 million? Are we going to catch many more people?
Maybe not, but I certainly think that some of the governing bodies could maybe put some more money in, or maybe pay for some more testing. It's in the interests of everybody to have a level playing field right across the board, and I think that's paramount. So maybe in the future more could be set aside by the governing bodies. I know that obviously much of the budget they would prefer to put into participation, and that would be certainly the case from Sport Ireland, but I do think it's in the interest of the sport to ensure that at the top level that there is a level playing field. So the user pays scheme is certainly one that some of the other federations could look into.
Okay, fair point. Take a short break. Final few stories with the lads next.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball. The Future Proof Podcast.
As far as animals go, human hearing is pretty lame. Bats, owls, elephants, dogs, they are the kings of this domain. But we underestimate our ears because we have the ability to hear very well in the right circumstances. On this week's Future Proof, we speak to the man who's built the quietest room in the world.
The Future Proof Podcast.
Proudly supported by Science Foundation Ireland.
Listen and subscribe to the podcast now on newstalk.com or on the Newstalk app.
The COVID-19 pandemic has been hard for everyone and tragic for many. We have suffered loss of loved ones and loss of contact with family and friends. By working together, our health services have been protected and lives have been saved. The situation would be so much worse were it not for the huge effort made by everyone. For all that you have done, for your patience and sacrifice, resilience and solidarity, thank you. As we move through this crisis, there are now 6 key things that you should know. 1. From Tuesday, May 5th, the 2-kilometre restriction is extended to 5 kilometres, and also people cocooning may take limited outdoor exercise. 2. From the 18th of May, we expect to begin the reopening of our country on a carefully managed, phased basis. 3. We now have a phased roadmap for reopening businesses, retail, transport, education, sporting, social and cultural activities, and a return to social activity over the coming months. 4. We also have a plan for easing restrictions on social visits to allow families and friends to meet each other. 5. We have a clear way for deciding when we can move from one phase of reopening to the next. And the priority is always to minimise the number of people who will get the infection and the number of deaths as a result. And 6. The social distancing 2-metre rule will remain in place, even as we reopen. The details of this phased reopening of our country are now available on gov.ie. Please stay the course. We're in this together. And please continue to save lives by staying apart. Supported by the Government of Ireland.
There are plenty of reasons to get an official Volkswagen service, from the expertise of a Volkswagen master technician to the confidence in using only Volkswagen genuine parts. However, to the majority of drivers, only one reason really matters: what you get when you bring it all together, an official service history. In fact, 78% of Irish drivers would pay more for your Volkswagen if it has a full Volkswagen service history. Help protect your resale value and keep your Volkswagen a Volkswagen. Book your classic service from only €169 at volkswagenservice.ie. Terms and conditions apply.
These days, we all need our euro to go as far as possible. With Everyday Savers from Dunnes Stores, we've got hundreds of everyday products, many for €1 or less. So whether you're cooking more at home or catching up on some cleaning, we've got everything you need. And we've extended our 10 off 50 grocery voucher from 10 to 21 days. So your euro goes further each time you shop. Dunnes Stores. Always here for our customers, always better value. Terms and conditions apply, minimum spend required.
Make life easy with Sky TV and Netflix all in one place on Sky Q. Now for only €30 a month. Award-winning Sky shows like Chernobyl and complete seasons like Game of Thrones are right next to Netflix originals like The Crown and Narcos Mexico. So if you love queens, kingpins or even whole kingdoms, we've got them all side by side on Sky Q. Now for just €30 a month. Easy. Search Sky 30. New Sky customers only. Setup fees, minimum term and further terms apply.
The Sunday Papers on Off the Ball.
Now you're welcome back. We're reviewing the Sunday Papers. We have Shane Keegan with us, opposition analyst for Dundalk Football Club, podcast host with the 42. We have Colm Keys of the Irish Independent as well. Just the final few stories to finish on, lads. There's some good ones as well, including Mark Gallagher with Seamus McDonough in the Mail. We have Neil O'Riordan talking to Dirk Heinen in The Sun. We have Wayne Rooney's piece in the Sunday Times, which I know you liked, Shane, and we have Paul McGinley doing a Q&A as well. Shane, why don't you lead us off with Wayne Rooney and how to be a footballer? He's been doing this over the last month or so in various pieces where he's been talking about how he became the footballer he was, and he did well. I think the best of them, to be honest, is well worth checking out. It's really good. Is on how to be a brilliant striker, in effect, the secrets of being a striker, and it's a great read and there's some really good insights in it. This is more about developing as a young player.
Yeah, it is, Joe. If you told me 2 months ago that I would have been taking out a subscription for the Times based on a Wayne Rooney column, I would have said you were mad. But as you say, he's been absolutely excellent since he's come on board with them. And this one, timing-wise, it's interesting because it comes kind of, I suppose, in the same week as a fantastic Robin Van Persie clip that was bouncing around social media. I'm not sure if you saw it, along a similar vein, talking about what it takes for kids to make it. And look, I suppose I'd be particularly invested in it, Joe. I've long been very interested in the talent development thing, and particularly the role that parents play in it. I mean, I just don't think it can be emphasised enough. I'd have it above the player's talent, above their physical progression. I'd have it above anything. I think that the role that a parent plays in a player's progression is absolutely massive. And Wayne seems to agree very much so. I suppose he talks about 14 in his eyes is kind of the key age where things really, really start to play out one way or another for you. It's kind of the stage where things will either accelerate or dip off for you. And he talks a bit about the area that he lived in and trying to keep away from the, I suppose, the temptations that go with living in a tough enough area. But it's the part where he goes on, my dad was at every game and I wanted to make him so proud when I scored. I always looked over to see if he was watching, and now when my lad plays, he does the very same. That is every kid. The biggest thing is, what happens if they don't score? What happens if they miss a penalty? Is that parent going to be in the car on the way home saying, why didn't you do that? And unfortunately, that is probably the majority of the parents I have encountered in my sporting sphere so far. And it just can't be underestimated. I mean, I really think the FAI have started to do a bit around this, but I think parental workshops where we can get into the minds of parents and try and educate parents on how they can be the best possible parent to help a young athlete progress, I think is absolutely massive. I did a piece before myself, and there's a young player at Pats who would have played schoolboy football with my own brother, and his dad gave the greatest exhibition of parenting I ever saw on a sideline one day, and I almost wanted to make him the pin-up for what parents need to espouse to be if they want their kid to develop. And Wayne just makes some really interesting points around it, I suppose, within this.
I found it, I have to say, I found it a very interesting piece. I think it applies across all sports, certainly all team sports, in terms of development. The first thing that struck me was, and then when you do the maths, he mentions when he was 14 in September 2000, and when you add it together, he's only 34. I for some reason I thought he was an awful lot more, but it is some great takeouts in it. His discussion with Darren Gibson, of course, to be more vocal on the pitch. That was one thing that stood out for me. I don't know what your voice sounds like. I just see you running around with an angry face. Even if it's the wrong information, just speak. So he sought from Darren Gibson, who he said he was really good friends with, to be more vocal. And Darren Gibson came out the following season, and he was more vocal. And of course, he brought up Ravel Morrison. So where did Ravel Morrison ever go? He maintained he was probably more talented by a country mile, actually, he says, than Paul Pogba, Jesse Lingard, all of those. But he's proof you can't escape the fact that there are guidelines every player has to obey in professional football. Some players live right on the edge, but just stick inside and still succeed. So he maintains Ravel Morrison didn't stick by the guidelines for a profession. But the bottom line is, and it applies across the board in any sport or maybe in any walk of life, those who work hardest will succeed. And the other anecdote at the end of it is from Alex Ferguson on the night of the Champions League final in Moscow against Chelsea. And the players were having a party, and Fergie takes the mic and he thanks the players and he thanks the families supporting him. And then he says, "Now I'm going to bed because I have to prepare for next season and for us retaining the title." That always struck me, said Rooney. I remember thinking, just have a night off, but what drive and what a clever message. So straight away, Fergie was putting last season behind him, and they were moving on to the following season, just like he was moving on to the following season. His thought process had already moved on to the following season. It was an enjoyable column with a lot of pointers for a lot of people who are probably involved in coaching, and for players, obviously, who are at developmental stage. There are a lot of good takeouts in it.
I got a good laugh out of Gary Neville getting the ultimate backhanded compliment as well. Gary's not a great football player, but he worked in every minute of every training session and made the most of everything he had.
Yeah, he's not afraid to just use a phrase like "not a good footballer" of Gary Neville.
A bit harsh.
Yeah, a bit harsh. But you take the point. And I don't know if you've ever gone down a Ravel Morrison wormhole on YouTube, but there's just such a sense of what could have been. He was truly phenomenal. I mean, he was bustling his way past excellent underage players and sticking balls in the roots of the net. Such a talent. But even, Rooney, I like the blunt language at times. He was miles ahead of Paul Pogba. He's not couching it in any other terms. I don't know who he's working with on the column, but they're capturing his voice. And the one, again, not to put this one down, the one on striking, the art of striking a couple of weeks ago was fantastic. Loads of great anecdotes in that. Talked about, grabbing hold of Danny Welbeck and saying to him, you always fall on your arse every time you take a shot when you're in on goal. Even, sometimes you score, but you always fall over. And we've all seen those strikers, they lose their balance when they're in on goal. And Rooney was talking about, you need to think about whether you elongate or shorten your stride as you're coming onto the ball, and you need to slow down that final stride. And almost, my words, not his, but have the courage and the wherewithal to just slow down that beat with the final stride. He was full of these kind of great insights. I thought it was
He's potentially going to make a good manager, Joe.
I'm starting to wonder, because I said this a couple of weeks ago in the paper review, I had thought he was just instinctive street footballer type. Yeah. That's how we always talked about him. And he mentions it in this piece again, as a 14-year-old playing in the number 10 role for the under-19s at Everton. He would go home and on VHS watch number 10s like Jari Litmanen and Gianfranco Zola and study their movement. I never had him down as somebody who was studying movement. I thought it was all instinctive. So I do wonder, yeah. He certainly wants to go that way. Who's he worked under? Ferguson? Pretty much Ferguson. Moyes as well,
David Moyes, obviously, too, yeah.
He would have had his couple of England managers, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't have even had him down as a good columnist a few months back, but he certainly delivered a couple of good ones, and certainly today's I enjoyed and looking back at it.
Yeah, no, the others are well worth the read as well. Just a last point, I do count myself as very fortunate that I had a father who would not say anything about any match ever. Beyond the odd time occasionally, you didn't look like you enjoyed it out there because there was a temper which would come out at times, unfortunately, on the pitch. But is the parent who lives vicariously and berates their child endlessly alive and well, Shane, in what you're seeing?
Oh, absolutely alive and well. And just that the guy I referred to at Pat's, Joe, to give you the description around why I thought it was such an exhibition. I mean, this young fella would be widely regarded as one of the biggest talents in the country in his age bracket. And in this particular game that I watched, Joe, this young fella scored 2 absolute screamers. He got kicked from pillar to post. He missed an absolute sitter at the end to win the game. It ended up being a draw. And I swear to God, throughout all of those various different incidents, his dad's body language never flinched. Absolutely never flinched or changed once. And when the final whistle walked, the young fella walked across to him and his dad said, "Well done. Did you enjoy that? It was a good game. Let's go home." And to me, that's simplicity at its best, you know?
Yeah. No, I think we might be a couple of generations away from it just yet somehow, but we'll see. So, Seamus McDonagh in the Mail, Mark Gallagher talking to him. You picked that out, Colm, and we're 30 years from this fight where he fought Holyfield, Seamus McDonagh. It was actually a very interesting interview. I didn't know much about him.
30 years next month, around the same time as the Italia 90 was getting going. He came in as Holyfield's opponent after Buster Douglas, I think, got injured after the Tyson fight. So McDonagh had actually watched, according to Mark here, McDonagh had watched the fight in a bar, the Tyson-Buster Douglas fight in a bar in Staten Island. He was living in New York. He had gone to New York, gone to America from Enfield on the border of County Meath and Kildare in the early 80s, and had been a very, very decent boxer at home. And his father, actually, the whole family, it seems, moved out there at that time. Boxing drew them out, his older brother. But a very good story. Battle with alcohol is mixed into it. And then the fight with Holyfield, which ended after 4 rounds. But to have an Irish heavyweight, he's a cruiserweight actually, but he was ninth contender in those years, and because of just the way the cards were played with Buster Douglas's injury, he got in to fight Holyfield. Within a year, he had lost another fight, and I think he was out of the game at 28. But he's since moved to San Francisco, and he's recreated himself as an actor, and he's taking some roles in acting. So he's more than 2 decades sober. So Mark points out that meditation is his big thing in the morning and helps him get through it. So he's taken some roles in some plays and things like that. I was interested to see he was friendly with Norman Mailer very early in his time in New York. He lived nearby in Brooklyn, and at one stage he enrolled for a literature course before boxing, obviously heavyweight boxing, took over. But it's still a name that's very much out there. I actually happen to remember around the time of the fight, and remember it was a big deal because he was from the same county. It was a very big deal at the time, and I often wondered. I have seen pieces with him before, but Mark captures it very well, and it's timely because it's a month out, and just to catch up and see what he did with his life and to encapsulate it there was a very interesting piece, I found.
Yeah, no, very interesting. He did the Leave Cert. He was working in a chewing gum factory in Kilcock for a few months, then tried accountancy in Newbridge, and then took off to New York. A lot of the family were out there, and won the New York Golden Gloves heavyweight title of 1985, which is a very prestigious thing and a very big deal. And as you said, the Holyfield fight came around. He said he was ready for it physically, but mentally just wasn't ready for it at all, and unprepared for how big Holyfield was as well.
Yeah, I suppose nerves do get to fighters when you get in with someone like Holyfield. I always remember watching Frank Bruno come out for his fight. I think it was 96 against Tyson, and I never saw anyone as scared going into the ring. So you can just imagine what it was like for him to be literally taken from a bar off Staten Island, having watched Tyson lose his crown, and you're in next against Holyfield. It's pretty daunting, no matter how physical you are or how physically tuned you are.
Tyson was pretty frightening coming into the ring.
I'll never forget Frank Bruno. That's one memory I have of seeing a man beaten before he ever climbed through the ropes. I don't know, I haven't seen footage of it since, but I remember watching it at the time and thinking, this guy is so scared, he hasn't a chance. And sure enough, he just put his guard up and he was battered that night.
From memory, did Tyson just come in with no gown, just come in his shorts and no music even, just straight in, all business? Is that how Tyson
I forget
used to come
that,
in?
but it was in his second coming. It was early in his second coming, and I forget how Tyson came out. It just that Bruno memory struck me that he was so scared. He was so scared going in there that you could really see it before the off.
Well, Seamus McDonough, it's a really nice catch-up. It's across 2 pages. Retired from the ring at 28. Says he feels lucky he did that. But a hole appeared where boxing once existed. When he fought, he was always able to stop drinking a month before stepping into the ring. But now he'd more fights, no motivation to stop drinking. When I stopped boxing, I didn't know what to do. It had been my life, to be honest. I just thought, great, I can just keep drinking now. But the thing was, I was 28, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, couldn't figure it out, had all these fears. What drinking does is it numbs the fears. But when you're an alcoholic, that doesn't work anymore. The fears become worse and make you drink more. And then he moved out to the West Coast. And it was February 1st, 1996. Someone told him about the 12 steps and transcendental meditation. He took his last gulp of vodka and hasn't touched a drop since. So there's real depth to him. He starts every morning with transcendental meditation, and then he writes down all his resentments and fears on paper. So plenty of depth to him. I'm sure you enjoyed that as well, Shane.
Yeah, you're very interested in listening to it there. I've set it to one side to read in the afternoon, but certainly a unique individual by the sounds of it.
You picked out a piece Neil O'Riordan did with somebody who is living in our midst, and we probably don't realise the career he's had.
Yeah, it's a real gem of a piece by Neil. He's done very well to dig it out. I would have heard of Dirk Heinen before, but to be honest with you, I would have just heard that he was a guy working down in Waterford who had played professionally in Germany, and I'd never digged into it really to find out just played in Germany professionally is certainly an undersell. He broke into the Leverkusen team in '94, which, if you think back, that was when Leverkusen were really, really flying and a very, very good side. And the other thing that happened in '94, Joe, was that he met a teenage Sandra from Waterford who was travelling around Germany. And I suppose what Neil does then is talks about how things played out for the next 20 years, both in terms of on the field and in terms of the bargaining relationship with Sandra. They got married 2 years later in '96, and by '97 Dirk was playing in the Champions League with Leverkusen having finished second in the table that year. They went out of that year's Champions League to a star-studded Real Madrid team at the time, but he laughs and jokes that when he talks to people about it now, they don't even know who Clarence Seedorf is, which I can tell you that he feel old too. So it did, but yeah, after a very, very good career, he suffered a couple of setbacks with injury and that kind of thing, and he was on the verge of trying to break into a German national side, but unfortunately had Oliver Kahn and Jens Lehmann ahead of him when he was at his peak. But yeah, the crack is that he's ended up via Sandra living in Kilmacthomas in Waterford, where he is basically known to everybody as Sandra's husband, and not really anything other than Sandra's husband, despite the fact that he is working away as a goalkeeping coach with the FAI Emerging Talent Programme, and now with Waterford United in the League of Ireland setup as well. But just a real gem of a story that Neil's done well to dig up there.
Yeah, really good. I'm sure you're looking forward to meeting him now and having a chat with him the next time you play them. He told Sandra he was the physio when he first met her. He wanted to make sure she wasn't interested in him because he was a footballer.
Nice touch, I thought too,
yeah. So he's 49 years of age now. I like living in Ireland and raising the children here because I feel life means more. Or sorry, not life means more. Life means something. Life means something. He said it's not about driving a Mercedes or a Porsche. You can go into the pub in your wellies and everyone knows and talks to each other. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a good environment. Some professionals miss the spotlight. I enjoyed playing football and the financial aspect of it, but in the end, I'm happy the way I am as Sandra's husband and a father. So, yeah, really good. And he's knocking around Waterford. if you
He's
see
knocking
him.
around Waterford. I like the fact that he says he feels that it's as important for him again to teach the young players at Waterford as much about life's lessons as it is about football. You know.
Yeah. Well, that's on page 44 of The Sun today. Neil O'Riordan talking to Dirk Kynan. If you're in the area and you're passing by Dirk and you know him as Sandra's husband, it turned out he was a big deal back in the day. Before we go, Colm, I know you wanted to mention Noel Walsh. I think Dermot Crowe pays tribute to him in the Sunday Independent today. Who is Noel Walsh? A lot of people won't know.
Noel Walsh was a very, very committed Clare GA man, primarily football. He was from Milton Malbay, but he was one of the great GA campaigners. He was very, very instrumental in repealing Rule 42 back in the in 2005. But throughout the early 2000s, he was one of a triumvirate of GA officials. There was one in Roscommon, one in Laois, Tommy Connoy and Anthony Delaney. Noel Walsh was a third part of that really drove the opening of Croke Park to international soccer and rugby in that period. And before that, he had campaigned relentlessly for the open draw in Munster. Prior to that, it was designed that Cork and Kerry would reach the Munster football final every year, and that gave none of the other teams really a chance of ever getting that far. But in 1990, Noel Walsh, after nearly 10 years, there was the famous Milltown massacre where Kerry put 9 goals on Clare in a Munster Championship match. And it was after that that Noel campaigned for an open draw in Munster. And after 10 years, it was a bit like Andy Dufresne writing the letters in the Shawshank. They eventually relented and says, let's give him his open draw in Munster. And in 1991, Limerick reached the Munster final. Came close, they pushed Kerry very hard that year. And in 1992, that famous win in Limerick, Clare, with Noel actually a selector that year, they pushed through and won that famously in 1992. And he was very much prominent in everything with Clare. He was a great character. He went for the GAA presidency, I think, in 2000. He lost and delivered one of the funniest speeches I think you'll ever see in Congress. Is not noticed for its humour, but Noel was a great character. He delivered a great speech in defeat that day that went down very well. It's not what you would normally have expected, but very prominent in the years that followed in opening up Croke Park, and he'd be missed by everyone down in Clare. He was one of the great campaigners.
Okay, well, we'll finish on that point. My thanks to both of you for taking time out today. Enjoy the rest of the bank holiday weekend. Colm Keys of the Irish Independent and Shane Keegan as well.
Cheers, Colm.
Podcast host with 42 and opposition analyst for Dundalk. Thanks again, fellas. Much appreciated. Coming up after 3 o'clock, we're going to bring you a full hour feature-length interview with Jim Beglin, who was in really good form and talked about a whole range of things. So Jim Beglin on the way after news headlines at 3.